In a frozen world far from Earth, an alien princess faces the most impossible choice of her life. Leave everything she's ever known for a human who is her only hope of survival. But the stakes are higher than either of them can imagine. Princess Orla stood in the grand hall of her icy fortress, staring out across the endless fields of snow that blanketed her homeworld. The wind howled through the crystal spires of her palace, but the sound did little to disturb her. In fact, it was a sound she had grown to love, one that mirrored the cold, relentless nature of the world she ruled. She was the heir to the Crystallion Empire, a civilization forged in the harshest of environments, where only the strongest survived. The Crystallians were a people made of ice and fire, capable of breathing the freezing air and withstanding the biting winds that ravaged their planet. Yet, despite her ability to command such power, Orla often felt as though she was nothing more than a wisp of vapor in a vast, unfeeling storm. From the moment she had drawn her first breath, the expectations placed on her were overwhelming. She had been raised in the shadow of her father, the Emperor, a man whose ruthlessness had carved a path of dominance through the galaxy. He had ruled with an iron fist, demanding loyalty from his people while coldly dismissing the weaknesses that he viewed as the flaws of any ruler. In his eyes, compassion was a liability, and from the day Orla had been named his heir, she had been molded to fit his image of a leader, unyielding, emotionless, and cold as the ice that surrounded her kingdom. Her father had taught her to suppress every soft sentiment, every flicker of warmth that threatened to break through the thick shell of icy composure she had been trained to build. Strength, he had said, was the only thing that mattered. Strength could conquer planets. Strength could build empires. Strength would secure her place among the stars. It was a lesson she had taken to heart, though, at times, she wondered if that lesson had come at too great a cost. Orla had always been isolated, even in her own palace. Her people respected her as their princess, but it was a distant respect, born out of fear and duty rather than affection. She had never known true friendship, never known the warmth of a heart that was unburdened by responsibility. She was the princess, the future ruler, and to many, that made her untouchable. She was always watched, always evaluated, and in a world of ice and coldness, her heart had slowly begun to freeze. But it wasn't just the coldness of her people that isolated her. It was her own. She had come to believe that she could never truly connect with anyone. Her thoughts were consumed by the Empire, by the future she was expected to lead them into. Love? Companionship? Those were luxuries for the weak, things that had no place in a ruler's heart. But deep down, Orla knew something darker. The weight of the Empire, the responsibility to every living being on her frozen world, had grown too heavy to bear alone. Her heart ached in a way she had long ago learned to silence. And it was in that silence that she had learned to distrust the very emotions that made her human. Her father's voice echoed in her mind, demanding that she focus, demanding that she be strong. He had never once spoken of love or tenderness or the importance of a heart that could feel. In the Crystallion Empire, love was a weakness, something to be discarded for the sake of power and control. So, Orla had built walls of ice and iron around herself. And though they protected her from the world, they also kept her apart from it. And yet, as she stood there, gazing out into the storm, something inside her stirred. A faint memory lingered in her mind. An ancient story her mother had once told her. It was about a time when the Crystallion people had been different, when they had known warmth and love. But that was before the war, before the Empire had taken its current, unyielding form. That was before Orla had been born into this world of cold, where even the sun seemed reluctant to shine. For a brief moment, Orla allowed herself to dream of something else, a life beyond the palace, beyond the Empire. But the thought quickly dissipated as the weight of her duty settled back onto her shoulders. There was no escape from it. She was the princess, she was the heir to the throne, and in a world as cold as hers, there was no room for weakness. Her reverie was interrupted by a sudden commotion at the palace gates. Orla's sharp ice-blue eyes flicked to the source of the noise. Her heart quickened as her guards rushed past, their armor clinking as they made their way toward the entrance. She knew something had happened, something important, and she felt a strange twinge of unease. Within moments, the doors to the hall swung open, and a group of royal guards entered, their expressions tense. Among them, one of her trusted advisors, Commander Rioson, stepped forward. "Princess Orla," he began, his voice urgent. "We have a situation. A human vessel has crash-landed on the outskirts of the capital. A rescue mission has been dispatched, but we need your assistance." Orla's brow furrowed. A human? Here, on her icy world? It was unheard of. The humans had always been a distant race, barely acknowledged by the Crystallians, their worlds separated by vast stretches of space. Why would a human ship be anywhere near the frozen expanse of her planet? "Tell me more," Orla demanded, her voice sharp with authority. Ryson hesitated for a moment before continuing, his eyes shifting uncomfortably. "The ship's crew is gone, Princess. There is only one survivor, an astronaut stranded on our world with no way to return to his own. We believe he may have been sent on a diplomatic mission, but there are complications. We need to act quickly." Orla felt the familiar, icy grip of duty take hold of her once again. A human stranded on her planet? The very idea was preposterous. The Crystallians had never had dealings with the humans. Yet here was a man, alone and vulnerable, in need of her help. This was not a simple rescue. This was something more. A sign that the world she had known was changing in ways she couldn't yet understand. "I will go," Orla declared, her voice firm. "Prepare my ship. I'll oversee the operation personally." As she turned to leave, a strange thought flitted through her mind. The cold, the isolation. Was this all she had to look forward to? A life of duty, of endless power struggles, with no room for connection? Or was this human, stranded in the snow, the first hint of something else? A chance for something more than the frozen world she had known her entire life. With a flick of her cloak, Orla stepped out into the snow, the chill of the air biting at her skin. She had no idea what awaited her in the storm, but something deep within her whispered that her life, her empire, was about to be forever changed. And as the snowflakes danced around her, she couldn't shake the feeling that the human, lost and alone in the vast whiteness, was the key to it all. Her path had taken an unexpected turn, and Orla knew for the first time in years that the cold might not be the only thing she had to face. Orla's ship glided smoothly through the snowstorm, the biting cold outside only a faint whisper against the ship's shields. Inside, everything was calm, yet Orla could feel the tension tightening within her chest. She had seen this kind of snowstorm before, violent, unrelenting, and dangerous. Her people had survived countless storms like this, yet the chill of uncertainty gripped her in a way she had never known. The mission ahead felt unfamiliar, even though she had been trained for every crisis imaginable. As they approached the crash site, the wreckage of the human ship came into view. Its once pristine metallic surface was now battered and scarred, half buried in the thick snowdrifts. The ship had been brought down by something far beyond her understanding. The idea of a human vassal on her planet, lost and stranded in the midst of her world's coldest, most hostile environment, felt like a contradiction. How could someone so fragile, so soft, survive here? The Crystallians had adapted to their frozen home, but humans, Humans were not built for this. They were not meant for this cold. The thought of the lone human survivor lying somewhere within the wreckage only deepened the tension in her mind. She had heard rumors about the humans, their advanced technology, their aggression, and their recklessness. The Crystallians had always avoided them, preferring to remain in their isolated corner of the galaxy. Humans were a distant, foreign presence, one that Orla had only heard about in passing, but now one of them was here. On her world, her thoughts raced as the ship descended. The human would be brought aboard, alive or not, and when they were face to face, Orla knew that everything she had ever known would be called into question. The door to the human's makeshift shelter opened with a hiss, and the first thing Orla noticed was the heat. It was the strange kind of heat that seemed to radiate from his skin, like an energy she had never encountered before. The human stood, his frame slightly hunched under the weight of the cold, his movements stiff as he adjusted to his surroundings. She had never seen a creature like him, so soft, so vulnerable, yet so full of life. There was something about him that pulled her attention. He wore a suit designed to withstand the freezing temperatures, but even that didn't seem to protect him completely. His face was pale, eyes bloodshot, but they sparkled with a light that seemed to cut through the gloom of the storm outside. His hair was dark, tousled from the crash, and his body bore the marks of someone who had endured much. Yet, despite the exhaustion, despite the isolation, he stood taller than most men she had encountered in her own empire. And then his eyes met hers. For a moment, Orla felt a strange pang in her chest, as if the world outside had momentarily ceased to exist. The cold, the endless white wasteland beyond the shelter's walls, all of it faded into insignificance. His eyes, those human eyes, held something that she couldn't quite place. Curiosity, vulnerability, but also a quiet strength that seemed to be anchored deep inside of him. There was no fear in his gaze, no terror of the unknown that she expected. Instead, there was a calm resolve, the kind that she hadn't seen in many of her own people. "Princess Orla!" His voice was rough, barely a whisper, but it carried across the room, sending a shiver down her spine. "I didn't think anyone would find me." Her first instinct was to close the distance, to command him to stand and explain himself. The audacity of a human, on her planet, in her domain, shocked her. He was supposed to be weak, to show fear, to be a broken figure in need of her mercy. But instead he stood tall, meeting her eyes with a steadiness that unnerved her. "I am here to help you," Orla said, her voice colder than she intended. "Your ship crashed. You were not supposed to be here." The human nodded slowly, clearly exhausted. "I didn't mean to come. I was on a mission. But something went wrong." Orla's lips pressed into a thin line. She could feel her suspicions growing. Something about this entire situation didn't sit right with her. Why had the humans been so close to her world? What was the true purpose of this mission? She had known for some time that her people had kept their distance from humans, that the Crystallians viewed them as a threat, unpredictable, dangerous, and with their own ambitions. And yet, here was a human standing in front of her unafraid and without a clear explanation of why he was here. Her heart tightened, but she forced herself to remain composed. "Why are you here, human?" Orla asked, narrowing her eyes. "What is your purpose on this planet?" The astronaut who had introduced himself as Ethan hesitated for a moment. Then he took a deep breath and spoke slowly, as if weighing every word. "My mission was simple. Gather data, survey resources in this region of space. But there was an accident, a malfunction in the ship's system. It wasn't supposed to happen. I'm just a scientist. I didn't mean to end up here." His words were simple, but something in the way he spoke struck a chord with her. She had expected him to offer excuses, to beg for mercy, but instead, There was only a quiet honesty in his voice. The way he spoke about his mission, so plainly, without any hidden agendas, made her question the narratives she had grown up with. Her mind, trained by years of war and strategy, immediately began to analyze. She could have ordered him confined to the ship, isolated until she knew more, but for some reason the thought didn't sit right with her. The human wasn't a threat, not in the way she had imagined. He was not aggressive, he wasn't the enemy. In fact, there was something about him that made her feel unsettled, though she couldn't pinpoint exactly why. As she stood in the sterile, dimly lit shelter, surrounded by the remnants of his crash, the snowstorm outside continuing its relentless assault, Orla found herself studying him in a way she had never studied another being. He was so different from her. His warmth, his softness, his humanity. All of it was foreign to her. And yet, it intrigued her in a way she didn't understand. "You'll be staying with us," Orla said abruptly, breaking the silence. "We'll get you back to your people once the storm clears." Ethan gave her a small nod, his tired eyes still locked on hers. "I appreciate that. Thank you." But in that moment, Orla felt something stir deep within her. Was this truly an act of mercy? Or was there something else at play here? Something she had never considered before. As the storm raged outside, Orla found herself facing a conflict she had never anticipated. The human Ethan was not the enemy, but could she truly trust him? Or was he just another piece in a much larger game, one that would force her to confront everything she had been taught about her people, her role, and the very world she had always known? And as the snowflakes continued to fall, covering her planet in an unbroken white sheet, Orla realized that she was no longer sure of the answers. She had been trained to lead with strength, with certainty. But this human, this stranger, was making her question everything she had ever believed. Orla watched Ethan for several moments after the tension in the room had settled. There was a quiet strength in him that she hadn't expected. A resilience that defied her expectations of human fragility. He wasn't like the warriors of her empire. There was no ice-cold edge to him, no hardened mask of authority. His body was soft compared to the Crystallians, but the fire within him, the way he stood tall, despite the overwhelming cold and uncertainty, caught her attention in ways she couldn't explain. Her suspicions had initially clouded her judgment. The Crystallion Empire had always taught that the humans were unpredictable, alien, foreign, and far too warm for a world built on cold, hard discipline. There had been whispers of their unpredictability, their reckless nature, and their tendency to tear down anything in their path. She had always assumed that their emotions were their greatest flaw, vulnerable emotional beings who could be swayed by sentiment and weakness. But here, in front of her, Ethan was different. His eyes, those steady, unyielding eyes, held something she hadn't expected: determination and a quiet courage. That courage wasn't loud, it wasn't brash like the warriors of her empire. It wasn't the kind of strength Orla had been raised to admire, but it was present. It radiated from him like a warmth she had never known, a warmth that her culture had long since dismissed as unnecessary. In the midst of her doubt, in the face of his vulnerability, Orla couldn't help but wonder, was there more to this human than she had been taught to believe? Still, every instinct in her told her to remain cautious. The cold walls she had built around herself in her youth had always been necessary for survival. She had been raised to believe that strength, isolation, and control were the only things that mattered in this unforgiving world. Trust was something that could get her killed. Her duty to the Crystallion people was all-consuming. Any mistake, any hint of weakness could be exploited, and that could spell disaster for her, her people, and her empire. And yet, As the snowstorm raged outside, as the winds howled against the fortress's stone walls, Orla found herself questioning everything she had ever known. The questions lingered in the air, unanswered, like the cold that never seemed to leave her bones. What was it about Ethan that had drawn her in? Why did she feel the need to help him, even when every part of her told her to stay detached, to maintain her control? The storm outside worsened, and the biting cold crept in despite the fortress's sturdy walls. Orla's thoughts were interrupted when she heard Ethan's voice, quietly calling out to her. "I know it's not easy for you," he said, his words slow but genuine. "You're the princess. You have your empire to protect, and I don't expect you to drop everything for me. But if we're going to make it through this, we'll need to work together." His words hung in the air, more meaningful than any she had heard in years. The human was asking for her help, but more than that, he was offering his own, a partnership of sorts. For someone so alien to her, so different from everything she had known, his request wasn't just for survival, it was a call for connection. A connection that Orla had been trained to suppress. She turned to him, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. "I don't trust you," she said, her voice cold but honest. "I don't trust your kind. You've never been here. You've never lived in the storm. Your people have no place on this world." Ethan nodded solemnly, acknowledging the weight of her words. He didn't argue, didn't protest. Instead, he simply stood there, waiting. It was the patience in his silence that unnerved her. She was used to the bravado of warriors, quick to defend, quick to strike, but Ethan's patience felt different. He wasn't afraid of her words, and that, perhaps more than anything else, unsettled her. "If you don't trust me, that's fine," Ethan said softly. "But you have to understand, we're not so different, Orla. We're both stuck here in the middle of a storm, trying to survive. I may not know your world, but I know how to fight for my life. I know how to work with people I don't understand. If you let me, I can help you get through this." His words were simple, but they carried weight. Orla's gaze fell to the floor for a moment as she wrestled with her thoughts. She had never been in a position where she needed anyone's help. Never had she been forced to rely on someone outside her bloodline, outside the circle of her people. Yet here she was, standing in the ruins of a human crash site, contemplating the possibility that she might have to depend on this outsider for her survival. The blizzard outside screamed louder, pushing against the fortress walls like a living thing, a reminder of the harsh world they both lived in. Orla could feel the cold seeping deeper into her bones. This was no ordinary storm. This was one of the deadliest blizzards her world had ever known, and the longer she hesitated, the more dangerous the situation would become. As the storm battered the fortress, Orla knew that the only way to survive was to put aside her suspicions and work with Ethan. She had been taught to lead alone, to trust no one, to rule with ice in her veins. But survival had a way of breaking down walls, of forcing her to confront the harsh realities she had long avoided. And now that reality was standing in front of her. A human, vulnerable and fragile, asking for her help. With a deep breath, Orla spoke, her voice softer now, though still guarded. "You're right. The storm is too strong. We'll need to work together if we're going to survive. But don't mistake this for trust. I'm doing this because I have no choice. You'll do as I say, human." Ethan gave a small nod, his expression unchanged, and Orla could see in his eyes the same quiet determination she had noticed before. There was no fear in him, not the fear she expected from someone in his position. Instead, there was only resolve, and it was that resolve that Orla found herself drawn to, even as she pushed the rest of her emotions aside. With their fate now entwined in the midst of the raging storm, Orla and Ethan set aside their differences, forced into a fragile partnership by the unforgiving elements outside. Orla, once a ruler bound by duty, had to learn to rely on someone she had never believed she could trust, a human. And as the hours stretched into days, as the blizzard raged on and the world outside became nothing more than a blur of ice and snow, Orla would find that survival was no longer about her alone. It was about them, two beings from two very different worlds, learning how to fight together for the only thing that mattered, their lives. And perhaps, as the storm roared on, they would learn something deeper, about trust, about strength, and about the unexpected ways the world could change them, both. The blizzard outside raged with unrelenting fury, its icy tendrils twisting through every crack and crevice of the abandoned fortress that had become their refuge. The once sturdy walls now seemed to tremble with the weight of the storm, and the wind howled like a living creature bent on devouring anything in its path. Inside, the air was thick with tension, heavy with the knowledge that survival was no longer a matter of simple strategy. It was about endurance, about hanging on for one more hour, one more day. Orla sat by the fire, her gaze flickering between the flames and Ethan, who was tending to their makeshift camp. He had been surprisingly resourceful in the face of adversity, something she had not expected from him. In the cold, bitter silence of their shared isolation, the warmth of the fire was their only ally, and despite herself, Orla found herself watching Ethan, his calm movements, the steady way he worked, as if this was nothing more than a simple task. There was no fear in him, no frantic scrambling. He had become her anchor in the storm. As the days dragged on, the fortress, once filled with an oppressive silence, began to hum with the quiet sounds of life. Ethan's laughter, a soft, genuine sound, echoed through the cold halls, an odd, comforting presence in a place that had long since given up on warmth. Orla had never been one for laughter. It had always seemed frivolous, a distraction from the more important matters of ruling, of surviving. But Ethan's laughter, it was different. It didn't feel empty or shallow. It felt real, as if he could still find something worth celebrating, even in the midst of the worst storm of his life. One evening, as they sat together by the fire, Ethan spoke softly, his voice cutting through the silence. "You know, back on Earth we have a saying," he began, looking over at Orla with a playful glint in his eyes. "When things get tough, we say, 'This too shall pass.' It's kind of our way of saying that no matter how bad things get, there's always a way through, even if we don't see it yet." Orla glanced up at him, a flicker of something unfamiliar in her chest. She didn't answer immediately, but the words lingered in her mind long after Ethan had turned his attention back to the fire. This too shall pass. She had never thought about things that way. In her world, everything was a battle. Everything was a struggle for survival, for control. The concept of something passing, of it simply ending without a fight, was foreign to her. But there was something in his voice, something warm and steady, that made her want to believe it. Maybe, just maybe, they could make it out of this storm alive. Maybe, just maybe, they could make it together. The days melded into one another, and Orla found herself growing more accustomed to Ethan's presence. It wasn't just the practical things that had changed, like the way he had taught her how to make their limited rations stretch further, or the way he handled the cold without complaint. It was the small moments. The way he listened to her, really listened, as she spoke about her world, about her people, about the weight of the throne that she was destined to inherit. And when it was his turn to speak, she found herself drawn into his stories. Stories of Earth, of the cities he had seen, of the adventures he had taken before this disaster had brought him to her frozen world. He spoke with such passion, such sincerity, that it made her wonder what it would be like to live a life not defined by duty, by cold, by the constant pressure of ruling. But it wasn't just the stories that kept Orla captivated. It was the quiet moments of connection. The way he'd sit with her in silence, sharing the warmth of the fire. She wasn't used to that. In her world, silence was often uncomfortable, a reminder of the isolation she had been born into. But with Ethan, the silence was peaceful, like a gentle acknowledgement that they were both here, together in this moment, sharing the burden of the storm. As the days turned into weeks, the physical distance between them began to close. Orla could feel it, the pull of something unfamiliar stirring within her. She found herself drawn to him in ways she couldn't explain. It wasn't just the practicality of survival that had bound them together. It was something deeper, something she had long since pushed aside. Trust, connection. For the first time in her life, Orla was starting to understand what it meant to truly rely on someone. But as much as she felt this connection, it wasn't easy for her. She had spent so many years guarding her emotions, holding herself apart from others, that the idea of trusting someone like Ethan, someone so fundamentally different from herself, was difficult to accept. She had been taught that vulnerability was weakness, that emotions were a burden, and that rulers did not have the luxury of trusting others. They were alone, always alone, in the cold. Still, in the silence of their shared solitude, Orla found herself questioning everything she had been taught. Ethan had no power, no title, he wasn't a ruler. He wasn't even from her world. And yet, in this isolated fortress, in the heart of the deadliest winter, he had become her equal. They had to rely on each other, and in doing so, Orla began to realize that maybe trust wasn't a weakness after all. Maybe it was a strength she had never known she needed until now. One night, as a particularly fierce blizzard howled outside, Orla found herself sitting beside Ethan, her back against the stone wall, her eyes tracing the dancing flames of their fire. Ethan, as usual, was quietly tending to the fire, his hands working with a practiced ease that belied the fact that he was far from home. She watched him for a moment, a strange feeling settling in her chest. He was so different from anyone she had ever known, so human, so alive, so full of warmth. He caught her watching him and smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "What's on your mind?" Orla hesitated, unsure how to put the thoughts swirling in her head into words. "I never thought I'd be here, like this. Alone with a human, sharing stories, sharing warmth." Ethan's smile softened, and he leaned back against the wall, mirroring her posture. "Yeah, it's funny how things work out, isn't it?" Orla didn't know what to say to that. Part of her wanted to deny the growing warmth she felt in her chest, the way her heart seemed to soften every time he spoke, but she couldn't. For the first time in her life, she felt alive. The cold walls she had built around herself, the isolation she had embraced for so long, were beginning to crack. And though it frightened her, Orla knew deep down that this human, this stranger, had something to do with it. Days turned into weeks, and with each passing moment, Orla felt her icy demeanor begin to thaw. It wasn't sudden, it wasn't easy, but it was real. For the first time, Orla was learning to trust, to open up, and to allow herself to feel. And in the process, something unexpected was beginning to bloom between her and Ethan. A bond forged in the heart of winter, in the shared struggle for survival. But as the storm raged outside, Orla couldn't help but wonder, what would happen when the storm finally ended? Would she be able to hold on to the warmth that had begun to grow between them? Or would the cold of her world reclaim her once again? And as she looked at Ethan, sitting beside her in the glow of the fire, Orla realized that the only thing that truly mattered now was the moment they were sharing. Whatever the future held, whatever her duty demanded, she knew that this connection, this unexpected bond, was something worth holding on to, even if it meant defying everything she had ever believed. The days continued to blur into one another, each one marked by the relentless snowstorms that trapped them within the cold walls of the fortress. But inside, something was changing. Orla couldn't ignore it, no matter how much she tried. Ethan's presence, his warmth, was beginning to seep into the cracks of her frozen world. He had always been a stranger to her, a human in a place where no one like him belonged, yet now it felt as though he had woven himself into the fabric of her life in ways that were impossible to deny. At first, Orla had told herself it was simply a matter of survival. They were trapped together by the storm. They needed each other, and that was all. She had allowed herself to believe that there was nothing more to it, nothing deeper than necessity. But as the days wore on, that reasoning began to crumble. Ethan was not just her partner in survival. He had become something more. The quiet warmth of his laughter, the ease with which he shared his world, the way he looked at her, not with the cold, calculating distance of a subject before a ruler, but with genuine curiosity, began to stir something within Orla. It was something she had long buried under layers of ice. It was something she had never allowed herself to feel. She found herself looking forward to their conversations, drawn to the way he spoke about Earth with such fondness, as though he carried his home with him in every word. He spoke of the green fields, the cities bustling with life, the warmth of human connection, and though she had never known those things herself, Orla couldn't help but feel a longing for them. Something she had never thought to desire before. In their shared moments, she started to feel human. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to smile at his jokes, to relax in his company, to let go of the burden of her royal identity, if only for a brief while. But even as she felt these stirrings of connection, Orla couldn't escape the weight of her responsibilities. She was the princess of the Crystallion Empire, heir to a throne made of ice and ambition. Every decision she made carried the weight of an entire world. Every choice she faced was shaped by duty, not by love, not by connection, but by the cold necessity of maintaining control, of securing her people's future. Ethan, as much as he had become a part of her life, was still an outsider. He was human. He didn't belong to her world, and that, Orla knew, was a barrier she couldn't ignore. The more she spent time with him, the more the conflict within her deepened. Her heart, once locked in the unyielding grip of duty, had begun to thaw in his presence, and with each passing day, the thawing became more pronounced. She had never realized how frozen she had been until she felt the warmth of his care, the tenderness in his voice, the way he treated her, not as a princess, not as a ruler, but as a person, as someone who could share in the same vulnerabilities as him. But she was still a princess, and the cold reality of her position pulled at her like the weight of the frozen world outside. Her people depended on her. The Empire depended on her. One evening, as they sat by the fire, the wind howling outside, Orla found herself staring into the flames, lost in thought. Ethan, sitting beside her, seemed to sense her unease. He didn't speak at first, just sat quietly, allowing the silence to settle between them. It was a silence that was no longer uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that spoke of understanding, of shared experience. Finally, he broke the silence. "You've been quiet lately?" he said, his voice gentle. "What's on your mind?" Orla hesitated. She had never been one to share her thoughts freely, especially not with someone so far removed from her world. But there was something in Ethan's voice, in his quiet presence, that made her want to be open. She took a deep breath, her gaze still fixed on the fire. "I don't know how to reconcile everything inside of me," she said slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've always known my duty. My purpose was clear from the moment I was born. But now, I don't know what to do with these feelings. With you." Ethan turned slightly toward her, his eyes searching her face. "You don't have to figure it all out right away," he said softly. "I'm not asking you to change everything. I'm just here. I'm here with you, Orla." His words hung in the air, gentle and unhurried, and for a moment Orla allowed herself to lean into them. The warmth in his voice, the sincerity in his gaze, it was more than she had ever experienced before. But then, the weight of her duty crashed back over her, cold and suffocating. She had a world to lead, a future to shape. Ethan's presence, as comforting as it was, could not change that. She couldn't afford to let her heart dictate her action. She swallowed hard, forcing the words out, though they felt like shards of ice in her throat. "I can't just abandon everything. I have to go back. I have to lead my people. I can't be like you." Ethan's expression softened, but he didn't push her. He simply nodded, as if he understood more than she had realized. "I know. And I'm not asking you to abandon anything. But just remember, you don't have to carry all of it alone. Sometimes, the hardest thing to do is to let someone else share the weight." Orla turned her gaze back to the fire, her heart heavy with the knowledge of the truth in his words. She had spent so many years pushing everyone away, building walls to protect herself and her people. But now, those walls were beginning to crumble. And with it came the terrifying realization that she had to face not just the weight of the Empire, but her own heart. As the days wore on, the storm outside began to lose its fury, but inside, the storm within Orla only grew. Her feelings for Ethan had deepened in ways she had never thought possible. The cold isolation that had been her constant companion began to seem unbearable in his presence. Yet the duty she owed to her people, the responsibility she had always shouldered, pulled her back to the frozen world she had once known. The struggle within Orla was a battle that she could no longer ignore. The ice in her heart was melting, but the responsibility of her title, her empire, was a force just as strong. Could she truly choose love over duty? Could she allow herself to embrace the warmth of a human heart? Or would she remain bound to the cold, unyielding expectations of a princess who had always been alone? In the quiet, flickering light of the fire, Orla realized that the answer was more complicated than she had ever imagined. Orla lay awake that night, the faint glow of the fire casting long shadows across the stone walls of the fortress. Outside, the snowstorm had quieted, leaving an eerie stillness in its wake. Inside, however, Orla's mind was anything but still. It was a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts, emotions, and duties, all pulling her in different directions. She thought about Ethan, his warmth, the kindness that had melted the ice she had built around her heart. For weeks, she had allowed herself to feel things she had long buried, things she had convinced herself were unimportant. But now, the thought of returning to her world, of resuming her role as princess of the Crystallion Empire, seemed like an insurmountable wall. Her heart ached at the thought of leaving Ethan behind, of returning to a life that had once felt so certain, but now felt cold and distant. But the Empire, her people, her responsibilities, they were all still there, waiting for her to come back. She was not just Orla. She was the heir to the throne. Her father's expectations, the weight of her title, it was all tied to the frozen world outside these walls. And as much as she had come to care for Ethan, as much as she had started to feel alive in a way she never had before, she knew that her duty called her back. Yet, even as she wrestled with this internal conflict, another fear began to stir in the back of her mind. A fear she couldn't ignore. It was the fear of what her return would mean. Would she be forced to sever ties with Ethan, to abandon the only connection that had ever made her feel human? Or worse, would her people demand more of her, more than she could give, until her heart was nothing but a cold shell once again? The idea of losing Ethan, of losing the warmth he had brought into her life, was unbearable. But could she truly leave everything she had ever known behind? Could she turn her back on her people and her empire for something so fleeting? The questions haunted her, swirling in her mind as the hours ticked by. As Orla's heart wavered, not all in the Crystallion Empire were as sympathetic to her growing connection with Ethan. Far from it. The very idea of an alliance with the humans, especially one born from a princess's affection, was met with growing suspicion and disdain by the royal council and the military leaders who had long held sway in the empire. To them, the human was nothing more than a dangerous intruder, a threat to the stability and strength of the Crystallion people. In the shadows of the palace, murmurs of dissent began to rise. The royal advisors, many of whom had long been loyal to Orla's father, saw the princess's growing affection for the human as a betrayal of everything they stood for. They whispered that she was losing her edge, that the princess who had once been a ruthless, calculating leader was now softening, losing herself to something as trivial as human emotion. But there were darker forces at play as well. Among the highest echelons of the military, there were those who saw the alliance with the humans not as a threat to the Crystallians, but as a challenge to their power. They feared that any show of compassion, any potential alliance, would weaken their hold on the Empire. If Orla allowed her heart to lead her, if she let the humans stay, they would have no choice but to act. In the days that followed, Orla began to notice the subtle shift in the atmosphere. The servants who once greeted her with respectful nods now avoided her gaze, and the soldiers who had once stood in reverence to her began to watch her with suspicion. There was a tension in the air, a silent warning that something was changing, and not in a way she could control. One evening, as Orla and Ethan sat in the dimly lit hall, sharing a quiet meal, a message arrived. It was from the Royal Council, a summons for the princess to return to the capital. The message was curt, cold, a reminder of the duty that awaited her. The words hit her like a slap, and for a moment she felt the weight of them press down on her chest. Ethan, sensing her sudden tension, looked up from his meal. "What's wrong?" Orla didn't answer immediately. Her mind was racing, and she could feel the walls she had been trying to break down slowly beginning to rise again. "I have to go back," she said quietly, her voice betraying the uncertainty she felt. "The council, they're calling for me. They need me to return to the capital." Ethan's expression softened, and he placed his hand gently on hers. "Orla, I know this isn't easy for you, but you don't have to do this alone. You've got me." For a moment, Orla allowed herself to lean into his touch, to feel the warmth that had become such a source of comfort. But then the cold truth settled back into her bones. The world she had known was not so simple. Duty, power, the Empire, they all demanded her attention, and there was no escaping them. "I don't know if I can do this," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly. "I don't know if I can go back to that life, the life I was raised to lead. I don't know if I can leave you." Ethan looked at her, his eyes filled with an intensity that made her heart skip a beat. "Orla, whatever you decide, we'll figure it out together. You don't have to choose between us. You're not alone in this." But as the words left his lips, Orla couldn't shake the feeling that something darker was lurking just beyond their reach. She could feel it in the way the wind howled outside, in the growing distance between her and the people she had once trusted. The Crystallion Empire had always been about power, and there were those who would stop at nothing to maintain it. If they thought her connection to Ethan was a threat, they would not hesitate to tear them apart. And so, as Orla gazed into Ethan's eyes, she knew that the path ahead was more dangerous than ever. The unseen threat within her own kingdom was growing, and the more her feelings for Ethan deepened, the more the forces of ambition, betrayal, and politics would rise against them. She couldn't ignore the storm brewing within her empire. The winds of change were rising, and she would have to face them, no matter what the cost. The wind howled outside, pressing against the fortress walls like a living force. But inside, Orla felt the weight of the storm growing heavier. Not from the elements, but from the storm raging within her. She had always known this moment would come. The moment when duty and love would clash. When she would be forced to choose between the cold, unforgiving world she was born to lead and the warmth of the human who had melted the walls around her heart. But it wasn't just her choice to make. Ethan sat across from her, his face illuminated by the dim light of the fire. His eyes were focused, his posture relaxed, but Orla could see the quiet conflict in his gaze. He had never been the type to demand anything from her, never pressed her for answers. But now, the question between them was unavoidable. Could she stay with him? Abandon the empire she was meant to rule and forge a new future together? Or was she bound by the unbreakable chains of duty, destined to return to the frozen throne that had shaped her life? The thought of leaving Ethan behind, of turning away from the first person who had ever made her feel truly alive, felt like a death sentence. But she could not escape the pull of her past. The responsibilities she had inherited, the empire that demanded her loyalty. She had been born for this, trained for it from the moment she had taken her first breath. Her people were counting on her. Her father's legacy loomed over her like a shadow, a constant reminder of what she was supposed to be, not what she had come to want. She looked at Ethan, his face a quiet mask of uncertainty, and felt a pang of guilt. She had never meant to drag him into this, never meant for him to become entangled in the web of her royal life. He had come here by accident, a mere survivor of a crash, but in the time they had spent together, he had become so much more than that. He had become her partner, her equal. Someone she could rely on in a way she had never trusted anyone before. But the question still hung between them, unspoken and heavy. Could Ethan accept her as she truly was, with all the weight of her title, her people, her empire? Could he stand by her, knowing that the life she led was far from simple? Could he accept the fact that being with her would never be easy? That there would always be the pull of duty, of politics, of the forces that would do anything to keep them apart? Orla's heart ached as she watched him. The truth was, she couldn't make this decision alone. Ethan too had to choose. He had to decide whether he could accept all that came with her, her flaws, her burdens, her responsibilities. And if he couldn't see past the princess and the empire she represented, then there was no future for them. She would return to the throne, alone, her heart encased in ice once again. But if he could understand that she was more than just the title she bore, that beneath the cold exterior was someone capable of love and devotion, then perhaps they could build something together. A life, a future, free from the constraints of her empire. A life that was just theirs. She took a deep breath, the weight of her decision pressing down on her chest, and finally she spoke, her voice trembling despite her efforts to remain composed. "I don't know what to do," she admitted, her words raw. "I can't imagine my life without you, Ethan. But I can't ignore my duty either. My people need me. The Empire needs me. And if I leave, I will be abandoning them, abandoning everything I've ever known." Ethan's eyes softened as he reached across the table, his hand gently resting over hers. His touch was warm, grounding her in the moment, and for a brief second, the weight of the decision seemed to lift, replaced by the quiet reassurance that she wasn't alone. "Orla," he said, his voice steady but filled with an undercurrent of emotion. "You're not alone in this. I'm here. I'm with you. I'll support whatever decision you make. But I need you to understand something too. I didn't come here for an easy life. I didn't come here expecting things to be simple. If I'm going to be with you, truly be with you, I have to accept all of it. The Empire, the responsibility, the throne, and everything else that comes with you. Because in the end, it's not about the title. It's about us. It's about what we can build together. If you'll let me." Orla stared at him, the reality of his words settling in. He was offering her more than she had ever imagined, more than she had ever dared hope for. He was offering his support, his partnership, not just in the easy moments, but in the difficult ones too. The choice was still hers, but in that moment Orla realized that she had something she hadn't expected to find. A true partner. And with that, a glimmer of hope sparked within her heart. But the decision was not simple. The Empire was not something she could just walk away from. Her people were depending on her. The weight of her father's expectations, the traditions of her people, the endless cycle of power and control. Those were the chains that bound her, and no matter how much she wanted to break free, she knew that those chains were not easily severed. "I don't know if I can choose you, Ethan," Orla whispered, her voice filled with regret. "I don't know if I can choose love over duty." Ethan squeezed her hand, his expression unwavering. "You don't have to choose between them, Orla. You can have both. But it will take strength. Strength to forge a new path. Strength to be who you are, not just who the Empire says you should be." Orla closed her eyes, the tears threatening to spill over as she fought to control her emotions. It was so hard to let go of everything she had been taught, everything she had believed. But in Ethan's words there was a promise. There was hope. The hope that perhaps she didn't have to choose at all. Perhaps, together, they could find a way to navigate the storm that had surrounded them, to build a future that was theirs to shape. But the storm was far from over. The forces within her empire would not relent. There would be betrayal, there would be danger, and there would be those who would stop at nothing to ensure that the princess remained bound to her frozen throne. Orla and Ethan's bond, fragile as it was, would be tested in ways neither of them could yet understand. The test of strength was not just about surviving the storm outside. It was about surviving the storm within, and the choices that would define their future. Would they stand together, facing the darkness, or would the weight of duty tear them apart? Orla's heart was torn, but as she looked into Ethan's eyes, she knew one thing for certain. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. The winds howled mercilessly, their icy fingers clawing at the cliffside as Orla and Ethan stood at the edge of the precipice. The snow, a blinding sheet of white, whipped around them with such intensity that it seemed as though the very world was trying to tear them apart. Orla could barely hear the words she shouted to Ethan over the roar of the storm, her voice barely a whisper against the deafening winds. Her cloak billowed behind her like a dark cloud, her ice-colored eyes steely with determination. This moment, this choice, was the culmination of everything she had been running from. The culmination of her duty, her heart, and her future. Behind them, the Crystallion Empire lay in wait. Her father's forces, her own people, were closing in. They had sent emissaries, soldiers, diplomats, all to bring Orla back, to reclaim her as their ruler, to ensure she would never choose something as weak as love over the throne. The Empire, the future of her people, her legacy, all of it hung in the balance. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm of politics, of power that raged within her. But in that moment, on the edge of the cliff, with the wind lashing against them and the sky churning above, Orla knew one thing. This was the moment of truth. Everything she had faced, every struggle, every sacrifice, had led her to this one final choice. Ethan stood beside her, his gaze unwavering, though the storm had turned him just as cold and ragged as the world around them. His clothes were torn, his face streaked with dirt and exhaustion, but there was no fear in his eyes, only a quiet resolve. He had always been steadfast, even when the odds seemed impossible. He had never given up on her, never once wavered in his belief that together they could find a way through this. Even now, as the Crystallion forces drew near, even now, as everything she had ever known threatened to collapse, Ethan stood by her, his loyalty as unwavering as the wind that threatened to blow them apart. "I can't make this choice for you, Orla," Ethan shouted over the storm, his voice barely audible but clear. "But I can promise you this. I'll stay by your side, no matter what. Whether it's your throne or your heart that you choose, I'm here." Orla's heart beat painfully in her chest. She had been trained her entire life to make decisions alone, to rule alone, to carry the weight of her empire by herself. But now, standing on the precipice of everything she had known, Orla felt something shift deep inside of her. Ethan wasn't asking her to choose him over her empire. He was asking her to choose herself, something she had never allowed herself to do. For so long, she had let the Empire define her. She had let duty and power become the only things that mattered. But now, with Ethan beside her, she realized that there was another way. The winds howled louder, as if trying to drown out her thoughts. But Orla's gaze never wavered from Ethan's. The choice was hers. But it wasn't just about the Empire anymore. It wasn't just about duty. It was about love. About the future she wanted to build. Not for an empire, but for herself. And for Ethan. With a shaky breath, Orla stepped forward, the snow crunching beneath her boots. She reached out, taking Ethan's hand in hers, her fingers trembling against his, but her resolve firm. She had been raised to believe that duty came first, that the throne would always be her most important responsibility. But as she looked into Ethan's eyes, she realized that love was not a weakness. It was the most powerful force in the universe, strong enough to face the deepest of winters, strong enough to unite two worlds, strong enough to face the unknown. It was the force that had melted the coldest corners of her heart, that had made her feel alive for the first time in years. "I choose you," Orla whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "I choose us, together, no matter what comes next." Ethan's face softened, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and affection. He squeezed her hand, the connection between them solidifying with that simple touch. The storm howled louder, but it no longer felt as threatening. The cold, the wind, the danger, they were all there, but in that moment, Orla realized they could face it all together. Her people, her empire would have to adapt. Her father's expectations, her legacy, they could not define her anymore. She was Orla, a woman of her own making. And with Ethan by her side, she could create a future that was her own. In the end, love proved to be the most powerful force in the universe. A force strong enough to melt the coldest hearts, strong enough to unite two worlds, and strong enough to face the deepest of winters. Together, as the storm began to subside, the world around them slowly began to clear. Orla and Ethan, once from two different worlds, now stood united on the edge of that snow-capped cliff, their bond unbreakable. The future, once uncertain, now felt full of possibility. Together they had chosen love over duty, they had chosen each other, and with that, they had forged a future neither of them had ever imagined. Hand in hand, they turned away from the storm, ready to face whatever came next. The winds might still howl, the snow might still fall, but Orla knew one thing for certain: they would face it together, unyielding and strong, and that was enough.